The Spirit drove Jesus out into the desert. And for 40 days, he was tempted, tested by the adversary, by Satan, the tempter. Those 40 days in which Jesus fasted and prayed for us, alone in the desert, were moments when he was tested and tried. And I love the fact that in the Gospel of Mark, we don't get a detailed description of what the testings or temptings were about. It leaves it open, because all of us on this human journey that we're about, if we try to be faithful to God, will indeed be tested by the adversary. It's important to know that. Reminded of C.S. Lewis's great book, The Screwtape Letters, about how the enemy is always trying to get us off track. 22 years ago, I was studying in the summer at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and the 4th of July holiday break came up, 4-day weekend or so, and I had heard about the beauty of the Canadian Rockies and thought I would take a trip up to the Canadian Rockies, but no one else was free to go. So I ended up driving alone up to the Canadian border and crossing over. And in those days, we didn't have the world of the internet to explore and figure out the best places to stay. So I had my handy AAA book, and I reserved a couple of rooms on the western side of the park, and then the last 2 nights, or the eastern first, and then the western at the end of my weekend. So all went well sort of at the beginning on the eastern side, and I drove over to the western side, and this little hotel that I had booked, when I arrived there, was extraordinarily desolate. Not a lot of things around, and it didn't look like the safest place to stay. So I pulled in and got into my room, and I was putting my suitcase there, and I had this very bad feeling that this is not the place where I should be. You know, it was fear and anxiety driven, I'm sure, as I look back now. But this unsettledness would not leave me, and so dark clouds were coming over the mountains at that point, and I went out and found a place to eat supper. And after I finished my evening meal, later in the day, as I walked out of the restaurant, I looked there over the mountains, and there was the most beautiful, immense rainbow that I could recall seeing. And the story of Noah today came back to me crystal clear. I will place my bow in the sky as a sign of my fidelity, never again to flood the world. It's the bond between me and you and all living creatures. And when I saw that rainbow, I drove back to that little hotel, and there was a no vacancy sign up, and the entire parking lot was full of cars. So suddenly this peace came over me. I'm okay. God, you are with me in this place. I mention that narrative because I believe it's important during these days of Lent that we be aware that as we intentionally try to grow closer to God, there will be movements in our hearts and minds that will try to take our peace from us. And the enemy can only work in a few basic ways. He either lures us off the path, entices us with something that seems to be good, but it's not really good, or he tries to frighten us off the path or discourage us. This is too difficult. This morning, there are 5 or 6 of you who will be journeying to the great Easter sacrament of baptism. And then you will be sealed with the Spirit and receive the Lord in the Eucharist the first time. And when we decide to say yes to the Lord, then the enemy tries to get us off track. So be aware of that. So moments of fear, of anger, of concern, all of those things that make us less like the sons and daughters that God created us to be are really the way the enemy works against human beings. And if you have any doubt about whether the enemy is at work in our world, look at all the brokenness in our human family right now, the violence in our world. Look at what's going on even here in our own country, how lack of community, misunderstanding, intolerance, all of those ways that we don't treat each other as brothers and sisters, as beloved sons and daughters of God. And then notice what happens in your own heart, the movements of your own spirit that take away that peace to which God has called you. Notice also the movements of the heart that reinforce in you trust in the Lord, like the rainbow in the sky. I find it profound that at the end of that period of testing, or maybe all throughout, Mark doesn't tell us, that Jesus became surrounded by all of those wild animals, just like Noah, just like Adam in the garden. One way of looking at it might be that all created things find peace when the Son of God is present and the angels of God minister to him. And for those of us who are journeying to the great mystery of Christ, and all of us are on that journey or we wouldn't be here today, the angels of God accompany us during these days of testing. We are never alone, right? The Lord is always with us, ministering to the needs of the human heart. So be aware, be attentive during these days of Lent. Pay attention to what is happening in your hearts.